A little boy, a candy bar, and a white cop who decided before asking a single question that the child standing in aisle 7 of a grocery store was a criminal. 8 years old, backpack still on from school, homework folded in his front pocket. And in the span of moments, Officer Declan Voss decided that Nolan Whitaker, this third grader with missing front teeth and light-up sneakers, was a thief. What Declan Voss didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that the call he was about to make would end his career, destroy his reputation, and expose a pattern of hatred that had been hiding inside a badge for years. The Ridgemont Fresh Market on Callaway Avenue, not the fancy one on the north side of town where the condos were going up, but the one on the south side, squeezed between a laundromat and a nail salon, had been a neighborhood institution for decades. The owner, a squat, permanently flushed man named Marcus Stafford, had taken over from his father years earlier and had over the years developed a reputation among the neighborhood's Black and Latino residents as someone who watched them a little too closely. Not close enough to be sued, not obvious enough to be confronted, just enough to make you feel it in your chest when you walked through the door. That particular exhausting awareness of being watched. One afternoon in fall, the leaves on Ridgemont's oak-lined streets were going amber and red, and the afternoons had that particular cool bite that made the whole city smell like wood smoke and wet pavement. School at Ridgemont Elementary let out in the afternoon. Soon after, Nolan Whitaker was pushing through the glass door of Ridgemont Fresh Market with his friend Jasper Brooks, both of them still wearing their backpacks. Both of them already arguing about whether the new superhero movie was better than the last one. Nolan was 8 years old. He was small for his age, with wide, serious eyes and a gap between his two front teeth that his mother Lena said gave him a smile worth $1 million. He'd inherited her cheekbones and his late grandfather's stubborn chin. He was, by every measurable standard, a good kid. Not perfect. He'd gotten a note sent home the week before for talking too much during silent reading. But the kind of kid that teachers described in parent-teacher conferences as a bright light. He carried a small leather wallet his grandfather had given him before he passed. Inside it, on this particular afternoon, was a crisp $10 bill that his mother had given him that morning. "Get yourself a snack after school," she'd told him, pressing the bill into his palm before she rushed out the door in her navy blazer, case files tucked under one arm, coffee in the other. "And go straight home after. Don't make me call Mrs. Brooks." Lena Whitaker, his mother, was the district attorney for Ridgemont County. She had been elected years prior in a race that nobody thought she could win. She'd won it by a comfortable margin. But Nolan didn't tell people that. He was 8. He cared about candy and superheroes and whether Jasper could beat him in a foot race to the corner. The two boys wandered through the store in that loose, unhurried way that children do, pausing at the chip aisle, debating the merits of Flamin' Hot versus Cool Ranch, drifting eventually toward the candy section near the back. Nolan picked up a pack of Reese's Pieces. He looked at the price. He thought about it with the gravity of a senator weighing legislation. He put it back, then picked up a Snickers bar instead. Better math. He was standing there, Snickers in hand, when Marcus Stafford appeared at the end of the aisle. Stafford watched the boy for a moment, no more than seconds, long enough to make a decision. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed. Officer Declan Voss had been with the Ridgemont Police Department for years. He drove a cruiser with a Pine Tree air freshener and a St. Christopher medal on the rearview mirror. He had a wife, 2 adult daughters, a Labrador named Buck, and a pension he was years from fully collecting. He coached youth baseball on Saturday mornings, always the white team from Northfield, never the mixed-race teams from Southside, though nobody had ever said that out loud. Voss was not the kind of racist who wore it on his sleeve. He was the kind who had constructed over the years a very comfortable internal architecture of justifications. He didn't hate black people. He would have told you he simply called it like he saw it. He trusted his instincts. His instincts, built from a lifetime of systemic conditioning he'd never been asked to examine, told him that a black child in a store in the South Side was more likely to steal than not. That was just probability, he would have said. That was just experience. He took the call from Marcus Stafford soon after. "Yeah, I got 2 black kids in the store. One of them looks like he's pocketing merchandise," Stafford said, his voice low, conspiratorial. "Back of the store, candy aisle." Voss was blocks away. He was there in moments. He pushed through the front door with the specific energy of a man who has already made up his mind. He didn't ask Stafford for details. He didn't ask to see camera footage. He walked directly to the candy aisle, where Nolan was now standing at the register with Jasper, placing the Snickers bar on the counter and pulling out his grandfather's leather wallet. "Hey, stop right there." Nolan looked up. He didn't know yet what was happening. He was a child. He smiled, the gap-toothed smile. "Hi," he said. Voss didn't smile back. He pointed at the boy's backpack. "What do you have in there?" Nolan blinked. "My school stuff?" "Open it." What?" "I said open the bag." Jasper grabbed Nolan's arm. The cashier, a young woman named Sofia Delgado, 19 years old and months into the job, stood frozen behind the register, the Snickers bar still sitting on the counter, unscanned. "Sir, he was about to pay," Sofia said. Her voice was careful, practiced in the way that young women of color learn to make their voices careful around authority. "He had the money out. I saw it." Voss looked at her with a particular kind of contempt, the kind reserved for people who dare to witness something inconvenient. "I didn't ask you." He turned back to Nolan. The boy had started to cry. Not loudly, just the silent, terrified kind of crying that children do when they're confronted with something their brain hasn't equipped them to process yet. His lip trembled. His hands shook as he unzipped his backpack. Inside, a library book, a folder with his homework, a water bottle with the Captain America sticker on it, a half-eaten granola bar from lunch, a pencil case his grandmother had sent from Atlanta. No stolen merchandise. Voss looked through the bag with the thoroughness of a man who is annoyed that the evidence isn't cooperating with his theory. He found nothing. He stood up, jaw tight, and looked at the boy. "What else you got? Empty your pockets." "Declan." This voice came from the door. Officer Kieran Larson, Voss's partner, had just arrived. He was younger, years on the force. He had watched this scene from the doorway for moments before he spoke, and the discomfort on his face was plain. "Declan, the kid has his wallet out. He was paying." "Stay out of it, Kieran. He's 8 years old." "I said stay out of it." Voss turned back to Nolan. "Pockets now." Nolan, sobbing openly now, turned out his pockets. The $10 bill, a folded piece of paper, the homework note his mother had signed, a broken crayon, a superhero trading card. That was all. Voss stared at the items. Something happened behind his eyes. Not remorse, not yet. Maybe never. But the particular recalibration of a man who realizes he has no legal ground to stand on and needs to reframe the situation quickly. "All right," he said. His voice had shifted to a flat bureaucratic register. "You're free to go, but I'm watching you." He said that last part, looking directly at the child. "I'm watching you," to an 8-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong, who had his grandfather's wallet, who had a $10 bill his mother gave him that morning. Sofia Delgado scanned the Snickers bar. Nolan paid with shaking hands. He and Jasper walked out of the store. They didn't speak until they were blocks away. "Nolan," Jasper said. He was trying not to cry himself. "You okay?" Nolan didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said in a very small voice, "I want my mom." Lena Whitaker was in a meeting when her phone buzzed. She was sitting across a long mahogany table from defense attorneys and her own prosecutors in the middle of a pre-trial conference for a major fraud case. The kind of meeting that couldn't be interrupted for anything short of a genuine emergency. Her assistant, Tamara Weston, knew this, which is why when Lena's phone buzzed for the 3rd time in quick succession, she excused herself. She stepped into the hallway and called Tamara back. "What is it?" "Mrs. Brooks just called," Tamara said. "She has Nolan. She said you need to come. She said he's really upset. She said a police officer." Lena was already walking to her office to get her coat. "Tell Mrs. Brooks I'm on my way." Her deputy DA and closest friend Nadia Thorpe met her in the hallway. She took one look at Lena's face and said, "What happened?" "I don't know yet. Something with Nolan." "Go," Nadia said. "I'll cover the conference." Lena drove the short distance to Linda Brooks's house in minutes. She found Nolan sitting on the living room couch with a mug of hot chocolate. He hadn't touched it, his backpack beside him, his eyes red and swollen. When he saw her come through the door, he got up and crossed the room and buried his face in her stomach and started sobbing all over again. Lena knelt down. She held him. She let him cry until there was nothing left. Then she sat on the couch beside him, his hand in both of hers, and she said, "Tell me what happened. Everything. Don't leave anything out." He told her every word: the store, the officer, the backpack, the pockets. "I'm watching you." Lena's face as he spoke was the face of a woman who had spent years in courtrooms and had trained herself at great personal cost to keep her emotions from showing. But Nadia, had she been there, would have seen it. The thing that happened around Lena's eyes when she was fighting herself. The slight tightening, the deliberate slowing of breath. When Nolan finished, Lena was quiet for a moment. "Did you do anything wrong?" she asked him. "No, Mama." "I know," she said. "I know you didn't." She kissed his forehead. She told Linda Brooks to keep him for the evening. She told Nolan she loved him more than all the stars. She put him back on the couch with his hot chocolate. Then she walked out to her car, sat behind the wheel, and allowed herself moments to feel every single thing she was feeling. The fear, the fury, the grief, the exhaustion of being a black mother in this country who had done everything right and still could not protect her child from this. And then she picked up her phone and called the chief of police. "Chief Danes," Lena said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness was the most terrifying thing about it. "This is Lena Whitaker. I need you to pull the in-store footage from Ridgemont Fresh Market on Callaway Avenue from this afternoon. I also need the body camera footage from Officer Declan Voss and his partner Kieran Larson from the same time period." A pause on the other end. "Lena, what's going on?" "One of your officers just racially profiled, harassed, and publicly humiliated my 8-year-old son in a grocery store. He was not committing any crime. He had money his mother gave him. He was buying a Snickers bar." Another pause, shorter. "I'd like to discuss this at your earliest convenience. I'm available tomorrow morning." There was a very long silence on the other end of the line. Then Chief Dane said, "I'll have everything pulled tonight." The body camera footage was pulled by evening. Chief Everett Danes watched it alone in his office. The door closed, the lights low. He watched it twice. Then he called his deputy chief, Frank Norwood, and told him to come in. Norwood watched it once. He put his head in his hands. The footage was, in the measured language of police internal affairs, deeply problematic. In the honest language of anyone with eyes and a conscience, it was damning. You could see everything. The child with his wallet already out. The cashier trying to intervene. Kieran Larson at the door visibly uncomfortable, and Declan Voss systematically dismantling an 8-year-old's dignity on camera while the boy cried and turned out his empty pockets. There was also the store's security footage. Marcus Stafford had remarkably agreed to hand it over without a subpoena. Perhaps he'd realized in the cooling hours of the evening that he'd made an error in judgment. The store camera showed Nolan Whitaker entering the store, selecting a candy bar, walking to the register, placing it on the counter, and reaching into his wallet, all before the officer arrived. There was no theft. There had never been any theft. There was only a black child and a white man's assumption. By evening, Danes had called Lena Whitaker to confirm he'd reviewed the footage and that it was, in his words, concerning. Lena did not say, "I told you so." She was a DA. She had been through too many cases to feel the satisfaction of being right about something this ugly. "I expect a formal review process to begin by end of business tomorrow," she said. "I also want to make clear that my office will be watching this closely and in an independent capacity." "Understood," Dane said. "Everett, She rarely used his first name. "This isn't just about my son, you know that." "I know," he said. After she hung up, Dane sat for a long time, looking at his ceiling. He'd been chief for years. He knew Declan Voss, had shaken his hand at department dinners, had accepted the annual baseball fundraiser donation Voss organized every spring. He was trying, in the privacy of his own office, to count the number of times a complaint had come across his desk about that officer, and had somehow found its way to a filing cabinet instead of a disciplinary board. He stopped counting at several. The story broke days later. Not because Lena Whitaker leaked it. She hadn't. She had, in fact, gone out of her way to allow the internal process to begin before speaking publicly. But Sofia Delgado, the young cashier, had told her mother what she'd witnessed. Her mother had told her sister. Her sister had told Brianna Wells, a reporter at the Ridgemont Courier who had been covering the police beat for years and knew the smell of a story the way a bloodhound knows a trail. Brianna made calls. She confirmed the incident with two independent witnesses who had been in the store. She reached Jasper Brooks's mother, who confirmed it. She reached a source inside the police department who confirmed the body camera footage had been pulled and reviewed. And then she published a piece under the headline, "Ridgemont Officer Accused of Racially Profiling 8-Year-Old in Southside Grocery Store. Victim is Son of District Attorney Lena Whitaker." By morning, the piece ran. It had been shared thousands of times. By afternoon, it was on every regional news channel. By evening, it had been picked up by national outlets. By night, there were people gathered outside Ridgemont City Hall with signs. The signs said things like Nolan deserved better. Black children are not suspects. How many others? That last one. How many others? That was the question that Lena Whitaker had been holding in her chest since the afternoon Nolan told her what happened. Not just for herself. Not just for her son. For every child in Ridgemont Southside who walked into that store or any store like it and was watched, followed, accused, humiliated. For every parent who got a call like the one she'd gotten from Linda Brooks and didn't have the title of district attorney to make the chief of police pick up the phone on the first ring. She held a press conference the following morning. She stood at a podium outside her office beside her son, and she spoke without notes, which was unusual for her. Lena Whitaker was a woman who prepared everything. But this, she had decided she would say from memory, from the chest. "My son Nolan is 8 years old," she began. "He is in 3rd grade. He loves superheroes and library books and arguing about which flavor of chips is superior. He is, by the standards of any reasonable measure, a child. One afternoon, a police officer decided that he was something else without evidence, without cause, without the basic human decency of a question asked in good faith." She paused. "I am the district attorney of Ridgemont County. I have the resources, the access, and the professional standing to hold this accountable. Most parents in this city, most black and brown parents in this city do not. And so what happened to my son has happened, and is happening, and will continue to happen unless we are honest about what it is." She looked directly into the cameras. "What it is racism hiding behind a badge, and my office will not look away from it." The applause began before she finished the sentence. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation into Officer Declan Voss within hours of the press conference. The investigator assigned was Sergeant Naomi Pierce, a veteran who had the reputation of being entirely unintimidated by anyone. She was the right person for the job. What Pierce found as she pulled the threads was not a single bad incident. It was a tapestry. The first thread. A formal complaint filed years earlier by a black teenager named Marcus Webb, 16 years old, stopped while walking home from football practice, patted down without cause, told he fit a description. The complaint had been reviewed, marked inconclusive, and filed. Marcus Webb had gone on to play Division I football at a state university. He was now older. Pierce tracked him down by phone. "I remember every second of it," Marcus Webb told her. "I remember thinking I'm going to tell my mom and she's going to say there's nothing we can do, and there wasn't. A pause. Is there something you can do now? There might be, Pierce told him. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? He didn't hesitate. The second thread, an incident in which Voss had detained a black woman named Carla Osai while she was jogging in Northfield Park, a park that was very much public property because a white resident had called 911 to report a suspicious person. The detention had lasted minutes. Carla Osai was a pediatric nurse. She had filed a complaint. The complaint had been reviewed, marked handled informally, and filed. Carla Osai was also willing to make a statement. The third thread, the fourth, the fifth. Pierce found several prior incidents involving Voss and black or brown civilians over the years. Some had resulted in formal complaints. All had been reviewed. All had been buried. This was, Pierce noted in her preliminary report, a systemic failure at the supervisory level, not an isolated incident involving one officer. The report named names, not just Voss, the supervisors who had signed off on the inconclusive and handled informally determinations, the review board member who had sat on the complaints, the chain of accountability that had for years functioned as a chain of protection. When Deputy Nadia Thorpe read the report, she came into Lena's office and put it on the desk and sat down across from her. This is bigger than Voss, Nadia said. I know, Lena said. Are you ready for that? Lena looked at the report for a long moment. She thought about Nolan sitting on Linda Brooks's couch with a mug of hot chocolate he hadn't touched. She thought about Marcus Webb at 16 being told there was nothing anyone could do. She thought about Carla Osai standing in a park she had every right to be in, being made to feel like a suspect for running. I've been ready, she said, for a long time. Declan Voss did not sleep the night the story broke nationally. He'd watched it on the television in his living room, the press conference, Lena Whitaker at the podium, without notes, her voice carrying that terrible controlled steadiness that was somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. His wife Diane had been beside him on the couch at first, but she'd gotten up somewhere around the third replay and gone to bed without saying anything. The silence she'd left behind was its own kind of verdict. He sat there until late. The television eventually muted, the room lit only by the blue glow of a screen showing traffic camera footage of the crowd gathering outside City Hall. He could read the signs even at that resolution. He told himself it was a mob. He told himself it was politics. He told himself that Lena Whitaker was using her son as a weapon, that this was a hit job, that the whole thing had been blown grotesquely out of proportion by people who didn't understand what it meant to do his job every day, who had never stood in the situations he'd stood in, who were perfectly comfortable judging from the safety of a couch or a camera. He told himself all of this with the fluency of a man who has rehearsed these arguments so many times in so many quiet moments of potential self-examination that they had taken on the feel of truth. He was very good at telling himself things, but the body camera footage lived in a different part of his brain, the part that couldn't be argued with. He'd seen it. He'd watched himself walk into that store. He'd watched himself tell the child to open his backpack. He'd watched Sofia Delgado say he was about to pay. I saw it. And he'd heard his own voice say, I didn't ask you. He'd watched the boy's lip begin to tremble. He'd watched himself tell an 8-year-old with an empty backpack and a $10 bill to empty his pockets. He reached over and turned the television off. The room went dark. He sat in the dark for a long time. His union rep, Clint Abernathy, called him the next morning and told him to come in. Not to the precinct, to the union office on 4th Street, which was a squat beige building between a printing company and a dry cleaner, and which Declan Voss had visited exactly twice in his years. Once when he'd been named in a minor civil suit that had been dismissed, and once when he'd been a character witness for a colleague who was fighting a disciplinary action. He arrived soon after. Clint was already there with a woman Voss didn't recognize. Her name was Patricia Graves, an attorney who handled police union defense cases and who had, in Clint's words, seen everything. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the weary competence of someone who had been through this room too many times. She shook Voss's hand and gestured for him to sit. For an hour, she walked him through the landscape of what he was facing: the internal affairs investigation, the potential civil exposure, the national media attention, which she described as a complicating factor in terms of managing the process. She used the words internal review and disciplinary process and parallel tracks and documentation review. She spoke in the measured, affectless language of someone who was treating this as a procedural problem to be managed. At one point, Voss interrupted her. "How bad is it?" he asked. Patricia Graves looked at him over her reading glasses for a moment. "Declan," she said, and she rarely used first names. "Several prior incidents, complaints buried, body camera footage that is, there's no way to characterize it favorably. The store's own security video corroborating the cashier's account. A district attorney who has publicly stated her office is conducting a parallel review." She paused. "And the child's face on the front page of the Ridgemont Courier this morning." She slid the newspaper across the table. The photo was a school picture. Nolan Whitaker in a collared shirt, the gap-toothed smile, the wide, serious eyes. It sat beside a headline that read, "He just wanted a Snickers bar." Declan Voss looked at the photo. He didn't say anything. "The question," Patricia Graves continued, "is not if this ends your career. The question is how and what exposure you carry out the other side." Voss looked up. "So the career is already gone?" She didn't flinch. "Yes." Clint Abernathy stared at a spot on the wall. Declan Voss sat with that for a moment. Years. The badge. The pension, years from vesting fully. The handshakes at department dinners. The baseball fundraiser every spring. The certainty built year by year that the machine would hold him. He had believed, genuinely believed, that the machine was permanent, that it had always protected him because it recognized something in him worth protecting. It had never occurred to him, not in any meaningful way, that the machine had protected him, not because he deserved it, but because the cost of exposing him had always been lower than the cost of protecting him, and that calculation had now irrevocably reversed. "All right," he said. His voice was very flat. "What do we do?" Sergeant Naomi Pierce had been in internal affairs for years. Before that, she'd spent years on patrol and in the detective division. She had the institutional memory of a woman who had absorbed the department from the inside out, who knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically, and on at least 2 occasions that she kept very close to her chest, not entirely metaphorically. She was older, built like someone who had run a marathon every year for decades and had no intention of stopping. And she had a way of conducting interviews that several officers had described in the privacy of the locker room as surgical. She interviewed Declan Voss on a morning days after the story broke. He arrived with Patricia Graves. He was dressed again in pressed civilian clothes, a habit of presentation, an attempt at normalcy, a way of walking into a room as Declan Voss, the man rather than officer, whatever, the subject of investigation. Pierce noted it. She noted everything. The interview room was small and fluorescent lit, with a table bolted to the floor and chairs that had been uncomfortable by design for decades. Pierce had a thick folder on the table in front of her. She did not open it immediately. She let it sit there for a moment, its weight implied. Then she looked at Voss and she said simply, "Tell me what happened that afternoon." Voss told her. He used careful language. He said he'd received a call from the store manager about a possible shoplifting in progress. He said he'd responded to the scene and conducted what he described as a brief investigatory contact. He said when no merchandise was found, he'd cleared the subjects and left the scene. He said all of this with the measured cadence of a man who had been coached and who was trying very hard to sound like someone who had done a reasonable thing. Pierce let him finish. Then she opened the folder. She set down a still frame from the body camera footage, the moment when Sofia Delgado had said he was about to pay, and Voss had said, "I didn't ask you." She set it down, and she let him look at it. "You said the contact was brief," she said. The body camera footage shows a duration of minutes. During that time, the child, who is 8 years old, was made to open his backpack, turn out his pockets, and was told, upon no evidence being found, and I'm quoting your own audio here. She pressed play on her recorder. I'm watching you. The words came out of the small speaker on the table in Voss's own voice, flat and deliberate, and they sat in the room like something physical. That was said to an 8-year-old child, Pierce said. Can you explain the investigatory purpose of that statement? Patricia Graves started to object. Pierce held up one hand. She did it without looking at the attorney. She kept her eyes on Voss. He had no answer. He stared at the still frame on the table. Something was happening around his eyes, a kind of erosion. The architecture was cracking from the inside, slowly, the way old buildings crack, not all at once, but incrementally, fault line by fault line. I was acting in good faith, he said. Pierce moved the still frame aside. She placed the next document in front of him. Marcus Webb, she said, 16 years old. Years earlier, you stopped him while he was walking home from football practice on Elm Street in the Southside District. You conducted a pat-down search. When asked what description he fit, the incident report states, and I'm quoting the report you filed, subject's behavior was consistent with suspicious activity in the area. There was no accompanying description in any active case file from that precinct on that date. She looked up. Marcus Webb is now older and plays defensive end for a Division I program. He has given us a detailed statement describing the stop. He says you told him, and I'm quoting his statement, your kind needs to learn to move differently around here. Voss's jaw tightened. That's not accurate. His statement is corroborated by a bystander who was present and whom he identified by name at the time of the incident. We've spoken to that bystander. Pierce turned a page. Carla Osai, pediatric nurse, years earlier, detained for minutes in Northfield Park while jogging. She set down a photo of the park, a park that is, as I'm sure you know, public property. She set down the complaint Carla Osai had filed. She set down the handled informally determination beside it. She set down the signature on that determination, a lieutenant named Howard Beck. Several complaints over the years, she said, all reviewed, all buried, all signed off at the supervisory level by either Lieutenant Beck or review board member Dale Ashford. She set down both names on paper, their signatures, the dates. Would you like to characterize the pattern for me, or would you like me to characterize it? The room was very quiet. Patricia Graves said carefully, my client is not in a position to speak to the supervisory determinations. He's not being asked about the supervisory determinations, Pierce said, still without looking at her. He's being asked about the pattern of behavior that required those determinations. She turned back to Voss. Several incidents, Officer Voss, over the years, all involving Black or Latino civilians, none resulting in charges because there was no basis for charges. Would you say that's accurate? Voss said nothing. I'll note for the record that the subject did not dispute the characterization, Pierce said into her recording device. Patricia Graves said, that's not fair. The record will show what it shows, Pierce said. She closed the folder. She looked at Voss directly, and for a moment the procedural language dropped away and she spoke as one human being to another. Mr. Voss, I have been in this building for years. I have conducted more than internal investigations. I have seen every version of this conversation. I want to tell you something that I am not required to tell you, and that is not in my mandate to say. She paused. There are several people whose lives were interrupted by your judgment. One of them is 8 years old and had a $10 bill in his grandfather's wallet. The others are adults who filed complaints and were told by this institution that what happened to them didn't matter enough to act on. They have all given statements, all of them. She held his gaze. This is going to be resolved one way or another. The only variable at this point is whether you contribute to understanding what happened here or whether you don't. That choice is yours. Voss looked at the table for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I want to speak to my attorney privately. The suspension without pay came that afternoon. Voss drove home in civilian clothes with his badge and service weapon having been surrendered at the armory. He pulled into his driveway. Diane's car was there. He sat in the car, his personal car technically, but he'd driven it to work for so long it had absorbed the character of something official, and he stared at the front door of his house for a long time. His neighbor, Terry Hoffman, was raking leaves in the front yard across the street. Terry had known Declan for years. They'd waved to each other across the street on countless mornings. Terry looked up, saw Declan sitting in the car, raised a hand in greeting. Declan raised his hand back. Then he went inside. Diane was in the kitchen. She was making coffee, her back to the door. She didn't turn around when he came in. "How'd it go?" she said. Her voice was neutral in the way that a person makes their voice neutral when they are holding a great deal at a controlled distance. "They're recommending termination," he said. She poured her coffee. She turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen, at the man she had been married to for years, who coached Saturday baseball and had a Labrador named Buck, and who she had, she realized with a particular exhausting clarity, been not looking at for a very long time. Not the way he talked about certain calls, not the way he described certain neighborhoods, not the slow, incremental accumulation of things she'd chosen not to name. "Declan," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He said, "Okay." "Did you know that child hadn't done anything wrong?" A very long silence. "I had a report from the store manager." "That's not what I asked you." Her voice had changed. It was no longer neutral. "Did you know when you walked in there and looked at that little boy? Did you know he hadn't done anything wrong?" He couldn't look at her. She put her coffee cup down. She walked out of the kitchen. He heard her go upstairs. He heard the bedroom door close, not slam, close, which was somehow worse. He stood in the kitchen alone for a long time. Buck came over from his dog bed and sat at his feet and looked up at him with the particular uncomplicated loyalty of a Labrador, which does not ask questions and does not withhold itself, and is, in the middle of a reckoning, almost unbearably kind. The formal termination hearing was held on a Thursday in late fall in a hearing room on the third floor of the Ridgemont Police Department headquarters that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and decades of institutional decisions. The three-member panel consisted of Sergeant Naomi Pierce, a civilian representative named Walter Osai, no relation to Carla Osai, though the coincidence was not lost on anyone paying attention, and Deputy Chief Anita Sorensen, who had been with the department for years and who was known for having exactly no patience for what she called the protection reflex, the institutional tendency to close ranks around bad officers rather than face what they represented. Declan Voss sat on one side of the table with Patricia Graves. Clint Abernathy sat in the gallery behind them, the pen he held hovering over a notepad, as though he intended to write something, but never quite did. The room had public seating, and the public seating was full. Lena Whitaker sat in the third row in a charcoal gray blazer, her hands folded in her lap, her face still. Nadia Thorpe sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. Marcus Webb, now older and broad-shouldered and wearing a collared shirt he'd clearly put on deliberately, sat 4 rows back. He'd driven hours from the university to be here. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He'd just come. Carla Osai sat in the back row by the door. She had taken a personal day from the hospital. She had dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept the night before. Her hands were folded in her lap the same way Lena Whitaker's were, and the two women did not know each other. But the posture was the same. The posture of a person who has spent a long time waiting for a room like this and is not sure even now that it will deliver what it's promised. Patricia Graves made her case with professional competence. She argued procedural irregularities. She argued that the disciplinary process had been influenced by the political profile of the case. She used the words due process multiple times. She was careful and thorough and very good at her job, and everyone in the room knew, including her, that it was not going to be enough. Declan Voss was given the opportunity to address the panel. He had been coached. He used the words reflect and implicit bias and mistake. He said he took full responsibility for how the situation was handled. He said he had served the city for years with dedication and commitment. He said he understood the importance of community trust. He did not say Nolan Whitaker's name. He did not say Marcus Webb's name or Carla Osai's name or the names of the others in Sergeant Pierce's report. He referred to the affected parties. He referred to the documented incidents. He kept everything in the language of category rather than person, of incident rather than human being. And whether that was his attorney's advice or his own instinct, it was, in the quiet arithmetic of the room, a failure of exactly the kind that had brought him here. When he finished, there was a silence in the room that lasted several seconds. Walter Osai, the civilian representative, spoke first. He was older, a retired high school principal, a man who had spent his career watching young people be shaped by the adults around them. He looked at Voss for a moment before he spoke. "Officer Voss," he said, "in your statement, you used the phrase, 'how the situation was handled.' I want to make sure I understand you. Are you taking responsibility for how the situation was handled, or for the situation itself?" Voss looked at him. "I'm not sure I understand the distinction." "The distinction," Walter Osai said, "is the difference between regretting the optics and regretting the act." He held his gaze. "A child was singled out, searched, and publicly humiliated without cause. Several people experienced stops, detentions, and searches without cause over a period of years. Are you taking responsibility for those acts or for the way they were perceived?" A very long silence. "I take responsibility," Voss said carefully, "for my role in—" "Yes or no," Osai said. "Did you target those individuals because of their race?" Patricia Graves intervened immediately. Osai acknowledged her objection. The question stood unanswered in the room, visibly the way an unanswered question always does. The panel deliberated for hours. The recommendation was unanimous. Termination. Deputy Chief Sorensen read it aloud. Her voice was measured and official, and beneath it, if you were listening carefully, was the particular exhaustion of a person who has wanted to say this for a long time. When the hearing ended and the room began to empty, Marcus Webb walked out into the hallway and stood near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the street below. Lena Whitaker passed him on her way out. Their eyes met briefly. She didn't know his name yet, not personally. That would come later from Nadia's case review. He didn't know her beyond what he'd read in the newspapers, but something passed between them anyway in the brief hold of the glance. The particular recognition of two people who have been through the same category of thing and have come out the other side carrying it in the same way. Not healed, not finished, but standing. Both of them standing. Lena Whitaker nodded at him. He nodded back. She walked toward the elevator. He stayed at the window a moment longer, watching the street where the November afternoon was going gray and cold, and the trees along the block had lost their last leaves. He was thinking about himself at 16, walking home from football practice with cleats over his shoulder and the cruiser pulling up and the door opening and the hand on his arm before any question was asked. He was thinking about the call he'd made that night from his mother's kitchen, sitting on the counter while she stood at the stove and listened, and then put the spoon down and turned around and pulled him into her arms and said, "You know who you are, baby. Don't you let anybody tell you different." He heard that in a different way now, because here was what Marcus Webb understood standing at a window on the 3rd floor of the Ridgemont Police Department on a Thursday afternoon. That he hadn't fully understood at 16 the moment his mother had said, "You know who you are." That wasn't a comfort offered to make the pain smaller. It was an instruction. It was a weapon. It was the single most important thing she could have put in his hands that night. Because the night itself and the years after it were going to require him to know exactly who he was, to know it in his bones, and keep knowing it, even when the world tried to tell him something different. And he had known it. He had taken it to the field, and to the weight room, and to the classroom. He had carried it forward. He thought about Nolan Whitaker, 8 years old, at the counter with his grandfather's wallet. He thought about what that boy was carrying forward, The termination was made official days later. Chief Everett Dane signed the order in the morning and then sat at his desk for a long time afterward, in a mood he couldn't entirely characterize. Not satisfaction, not relief, something more complicated than either. He thought about the complaints he'd stopped counting at. He thought about the handshakes at department dinners. He thought about the easy, unexamined thing it had been to let certain mechanisms do their quiet work. He was not a villain in this story. He was something arguably harder to reckon with, a decent man who had not been decent enough, who had let the institution's inertia carry him past moments that had required his deliberate intervention and hadn't gotten it. He picked up the phone and called Lena Whitaker. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "I got the notification." A pause. "Lena," he said, I know this isn't enough by itself." "No," she said. "It's not. The Oversight Committee, the audit, that has to mean something." "It will mean something," she said, "when the next Declan Voss gets stopped before there's another incident, not after." A pause. "That's the work, Everett. That's what we have to make sure happens." "I know," he said. "Then let's get to it." She hung up. He sat at his desk. Through his office window, he could see the parking lot, and beyond it the street, and beyond that the south side skyline, low and dense and winter gray. And he thought about all the people living and working and walking and buying groceries in those blocks who had never filed a complaint, who had never been part of a case review, who had simply absorbed the thing and kept moving. Because what else do you do? And he felt, in the private morning quiet of his office, the full weight of what it meant to be accountable for a system. Not just when it failed spectacularly in front of cameras with a district attorney's son, but in all the quiet, invisible ways it had been failing for years. While the machine ran, and the paperwork got filed, and the complaints got marked inconclusive, and everyone who needed to look away found a reason to. Badge number whatever was retired that morning, the number would not be reissued. Somewhere across the city, Declan Voss sat in his car in a driveway. The pine tree air freshener swung gently in the cold air from the vent. He thought about calling his wife. He thought about calling his daughters. He thought about calling someone who would tell him he'd been treated unfairly, that this was politics, that the world had lost its mind. He made no calls. He sat for a very long time in the silence of a man who has at last run out of architecture to hide in. And block south in a third-grade classroom at Ridgemont Elementary, Nolan Whitaker was at his desk doing multiplication tables, his pencil scratching at the paper, the gap-toothed smile coming and going as numbers resolved into answers. His teacher, Miss Allison Gray, was writing something on the whiteboard. The afternoon sun was coming through the windows at the angle it comes in fall, low and amber and specific, and it caught Nolan's face in a way that made the boy look for just a moment like something lit from within. He was 8 years old. He knew who he was. His grandpa had told him. This story is about an 8-year-old boy in a candy bar, but it's really about something much larger. The quiet daily courage it takes to raise a child in a world that doesn't always see them clearly. It's about the mothers who fight back, not just for their own children, but for every child who didn't have someone to fight for them. It's about cashiers who speak up when it would be easier to stay silent, about partners who refuse to look away, about investigators who pull every thread even when the pattern underneath is ugly. Most of all, it's about the truth that justice doesn't fall from the sky. It is built painstakingly, one voice, one complaint, one letter at a time. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in you, then don't let it sit still. Share it. Like it. Subscribe so you never miss a story worth telling. Because the world changes not when injustice happens, but when enough people refuse to let it go unspoken. Be like Nolan. Know who you are and don't let anybody tell you different.